No.
Cool. I think should we start? Well, thank you everyone for being here today. It's a pleasure to have Jose Aragüez and present the book of the building with us here at the GSD. For two reasons. First of all, because it was the first event that we were asked to do and not we organized, that we were not asking. So we thought that we were already a pretty important group, which we are not. But the second reason is because the book of the building was already in many of our desks at the GSD by the time that this started happening. And actually, almost a year and a half ago, a friend of mine came to my desk and said, "Hey Eduardo, look at this book that I just bought at the Harvard bookstore. And let's look at all these people who wrote all these essays. It's amazing. You should buy it because it's the kind of book that's going to get sold out super fast, and then it's going to be very expensive to buy." So I was like, I had this FOMO moment. I ran to the bookstore and got the book, and happily, a year and a half later, we're presenting the book. So it's actually a great thing. To introduce quickly everyone here at the table, and Jose, because there's a lot of people, and it's always really boring to read everyone's CVs, but basically Jose Aragüez is an architect and writer based in New York City. He's an adjunct professor at the architecture at Columbia University at GSAP, PhD in Princeton. He studied in Granada in Spain, and he'll explain this a little during the presentation, but the building started around 2014. As a panelist, we have here today Chang, assistant professor of architecture, director of Jaja haha, yeah, Jaja, sorry, the Spanish way of pronouncing, founded in 2014, GSD alum, and apparently a very successful and professor here at Core. It seems like students are happy with her. We have Tony Paor, design critic in architecture. He's based in Ireland, his office, established in 1991. Kuehn and Malvezzi, design critic in architecture, founders of Kuehn Malvezzi, based in Berlin and established in 2001, and Paor Tamburelli, design critic and architecture here at the GSD too, founder of Bauku, along with other 5 partners in 2004, and based in Milano and Genova, and founder and editor of the magazine Design. So, with further ado, please join me in welcoming Jose to the GSD.
Do you guys have a little bit of water, maybe? I'm straight from the train station. There was a 1 hour delay. Sorry about that. All right. While that water makes it to the podium, well, I'm very happy to be here to potentially have the last of, I think, 23 events that we've done over the last 5 years. And I'm going to go through some of that in a minute, but I'd like to thank Eduardo and the whole Spain GSD team for their perseverance and their extreme diligence in putting this event together, this amazing panel. And so I'm going to just jump right in. Although you see it now as a book, but really this is a larger discursive project that we started indeed in 2014, and really has had 4 phases. So first, thank you so much. All right, so yeah, 2 symposia we organized in 2014. First one at the AA in June, second one at Columbia University. Then a theory seminar at Cornell in 2015. Then the actual book that came out in December 2016. And then a series of events after publication of the book that basically sought to assess the result of the project, the outcome, the book as an outcome, but also to kind of keep fostering the conversation around the project agenda. So basically, why would anyone do a project titled The Building in Architecture? I mean, that sounds like a little bit obvious, tautological. project started with a very simple diagnosis. I was a second year PhD student at the beginning of the decade. And as I was becoming more and more fascinated by the kind of intellectual expansion that I was being exposed to, at the same time, it became obvious to me that there wasn't a lot of discussion on architectural design, and I would tend to use that term at the time without being fully aware of what it meant, architectural design within scholarly circles in architecture. So in other words, there wasn't a lot of architecture in architecture. So maybe it was just me. I started to share this feeling with my peers, faculty, colleagues, and so on, and it turned out everybody agreed. So there was a kind of repressed quality to the issue. So what do we do with it? Let's just bring it to the surface. Let's gather historians, theorists, PhD candidates, and architects for a number of exchanges around that which is supposed to establish a common ground for everyone, which will be something like architectural thinking as a form of knowledge. So as I said, just to give you a sense of the scope of the project, I brought a few pictures here of the events we've done. That was the first at the AA, so sort of a seminar-like. See John McMorrow, Tom Weaver, Adrian Forti, Mario Carpo, Mariano Turi, Brian Norwood, Mark Cousins, Brett Steele, everybody was there. Heated debates, kind of British style. The second one at Columbia was more of a conference type of event. I see Enrique Walker, Stan Allen, Amanda Rizzo-Lawrence, Michael Meredith, Chumi, Joe Nachman, Silvia Levin, Hans Zarapolo, Michael Young. And these are some of the pictures of the events we did after publication of the event. So that's André Tavares at the Lisbon Architectural Triennale. That's Lars Müller, New York. It's a couple of years ago, just to the date, I think, at MIT. So you see a few familiar faces from the Boston area. Michael, Amanda, Rafi Siegel, Brian, and Amit Jackie. It's another one we did at Columbia with Bernard, Jorge Terpailos, Stenalen, Amal. That's in Chicago. See Sean Keller, Bob Sommel, Penelope Dean, Norman Kelly. That's LA. Silvia Levy, Mark Lee, Neil Denari, Dora Epstein-Jones. That's an lecture I did at Columbia. Over to Europe. That's Kirsten Geers, Christoph van Gerway in Lausanne. That's in Madrid. Silvius Rojo, Emilio Tuñón, Fernando Galeano, Stan Allen again. That's my hometown of Malaga, of course, you would like from southern Spain. That's ETH in Zurich, Jean de Wilde, Philippe Ursprung, Laurent Stalder. That's a lecture I did at the AA, this time actually in the lecture hall. That's in the Czech Republic, in Brno. That's back to the US last year, University of Michigan, an amazing venue with John McMorrow. That's the Turing Polytechnic, another amazing venue. This past December. And that's the last one I did, I think, at that's Der Verlage in Delft, with Michael Riedig, Arin Osterman, Ida Vizar, Samuel Frausto, Martino Tatra. So basically at this point, over 400 people have either directly participated in the project or helped in some way, so we're starting to put together a map of all of these locations. That's not up to date. We start to get it going now. Matrix of all the participants, basically at some point they all became to convene most of the top thinkers in the field, along with many practitioners and intellectual practitioners, while trying to appeal to both history, theory, and design practice. I'm going to be talking about this duality quite a bit over the talk. So those numbers are actually not updated. That's as of August last year. So right now we're actually kind of hitting 50-50, miraculously. Sample of the all of the posters, or some of the posters where the video has appeared at one point or another. The website we're also trying to put together now, just challenged to condense all of that info virtually. And what I'm going to do over the first part of the talk is I'm going to share with you very quickly, without elaborating too much, just some of the theoretical underpinnings of the project. So we'll be able to fit into the Q&A, but just to give you a sense of what the project is about in more kind of theoretical substrate. First thing is to say that the building is a necessary condition for a contribution to knowledge in architecture. So what does that mean? You know, we can and we must right about many other things, right? Like algae, bills and rental agreements, drawings, a community. But any number of those issues will be relevant to architecture only insofar as they relate to a building, right? So the building is in the foreground or in the background. Doesn't need to be in the foreground. It can be in the background. Actually, often it's in the background, but it's somewhere there at some point. Right? So this question of the necessary conditions is slightly philosophical language. It just means that the building is something like the main object of knowledge for architectural thinking. Now, this necessary condition, this main object of knowledge, changes from one design domain to another. So it is different, obviously, if we're talking about urbanism, or furniture design, or product design, or exhibition design. Any number of these design domains has its own defining object of knowledge, right, which is distinct and has a number of ascertainable features, let's say. Similarly, for the domains outside of design, we're talking about ethics, political knowledge, aesthetics, metaphysics, whatever it is, right? Now, this distinction among fields is essential, in my view, for two reasons. One is because as soon as we start to talk about interdisciplinarity, we usually tend to emphasize the areas of overlap, intersections between fields. But actually here the argument is that in order to be able to fully understand those interdisciplinary processes and their results, you actually have to be able to account very precisely for the features that actually distinguish all of those fields prior to that interdisciplinary process, basically. So I mean, what are the main objects of knowledge that actually define the fields that you are kind of discussing together? In other words, interdisciplinary processes are first and foremost rooted in difference. And now, the second reason why this is important, this distinction among fields, is that because you actually have to be careful, I think in my view, to kind of apply the right frame of judgment to the object, the entity, the person, the history that you're actually assessing or discussing. Right? So in other words, frames of judgment have to actually map onto epistemological objects as accurately as possible. Right? So that's kind of fancy terminology for just saying that you cannot judge a fish by its capacity to climb up a tree, or you cannot judge a goalkeeper in soccer by how many goals he prevents, but actually by how many goals he, the other way around. You cannot judge a goalkeeper in soccer by how many goals he scores, but by how many goals he prevents. So this question of frames of judgment, mapping onto purposes and objects of knowledge is actually crucial to when discussing and analyzing any number of entities, histories, and so on. So as a result of something that has come to be known as the theoretical term of the 1960s, which you know, those of you having taken theory courses may be familiar with, is basically a moment in the 20th century tradition of history and theory where architectural history and theory started to decidedly look at fields beyond architecture and other social realms, such as linguistics, psychology, sociology, philosophy, through the use of what Michael here and others called mediatory concepts. So concepts such as reification or signifier, signified, ideology, and deconstruction, mainly concepts coming from Frankfurt School dialectics, from post-structuralism, structuralism, Marxist theory, psychoanalysis, and so on. Now, why is this important? Well, for a number of reasons, but the one that's interesting to us in this context is because this is the moment when there was a drastic change in terms of architectural history and theory starting to import concepts and theoretical frameworks from fields outside of architecture. And that became a pattern, and here the argument is that that pattern basically remains dominant today. So in parallel to that trend, another one that started a little bit later, around the mid-70s, basically coinciding with the moment when Manfred Darfuri's theory especially started to be felt more and more across international audiences, the status of the architectural objects, the building, started to grow sort of more and more unstable as it appeared in more and more guises, in more and more forms, or masked in different ways. So the building as the hypothesization of power structures, the building as a facilitator of participatory processes, the building as a locus of phenomenological content, the building as a construct amenable to mirroring processes in the natural world, the building as something else. So this diversification, of course, it's a very good thing. It's a very, very good thing. Right? Basically, it's an index for the sophistication that architectural history and theory have acquired basically over these decades, basically in the last 5 decades. Now, the question is that the flip side of it, if you look at it closely, is that the object, and I actually had to clarify something here before this lends itself to confusion. When I say the object over and over again, I don't mean a building as an object in the empirical sense of the term, meaning the building is by definition a self-contained physical reality with clear-cut boundaries that dissociate itself clearly from the surrounding field, right? Like a pen or like a book, right? I don't mean the object in that sense. I just mean the building as an object of knowledge again, right? Which is a totally separate thing. A building doesn't need to be an object necessarily. We have math buildings, we have field conditions, we have a number of ways to kind of blur the condition of the building as an empirical object. That's a separate discussion. So again, the argument here is that the flip side of this tendency of the building as something else is that actually the building as an object of knowledge emerges more often as a medium through which to tap into or address problems that actually belong to fields outside of architecture than as itself a realm of research in its own right? So before I go any further, another thing to clarify here is that every time I speak about the building as an object of knowledge or this condition as the building as a medium to access problems in fields outside of architecture, of course, I'm speaking from the point of view of history and theory, right? So from the point of view of studio pedagogy and from the point of view of practice, it will be a totally separate, totally different conversation, right? So all of these arguments, all of these propositions are born into a critique of history and theory, particularly in the scholarly domain, not necessarily only the scholarly domain, but this is history theory and not practice and studio pedagogy, even though the impact and hopefully some of the influence of this project actually is meant to reach across to studio pedagogy and practice. All right, so based on that, diagnosis, Roger here attempts to suggest ways in which we can begin to kind of balance out these two trends that I just described, the building as and physical import. So what do we do about it? Well, first of all, we go from the building as to the building as such, right? As a domain of research in its own right, in a discursive sense, right? And I'm going to talk about discursive in a second. So we focus on the building, and then what do we do with it? Right? We can do any number of things with it, but we choose to do something very specific, which is to discuss what it means for a building to embody a historically significant contribution in terms of a design aspect, a building element, or a concept relevant to the reading of buildings in general. Right? Historically significant contribution. Right? Again, I'm not going to sort of elaborate on these things, but hopefully we'll be able to fill in later. And then second, the more ambitious part of it, which is to say, let's see if we can actually, beyond that, if we can venture ways in which buildings might become the seed for terms and for theoretical frameworks, which could actually have an impact on fields outside of architecture. Right? The seed or the embodiment of concepts and terms which develop discursively could actually have an impact on fields outside of architecture. So in other words, for the tendency of architectural history and theory to import over the last 5 decades, for that tendency to coexist with architectural thinking's capacity to export as well. Right? So in other words, I think one could say that the book appeals to architecture specificity in order to expand its limits and audiences, as opposed to withdrawing into its own autonomy. Right? So here's where this distinction between specificity and autonomy appears for the first time. And it's one that's crucial, I think, because these two terms have been way too often conflated, and we're going to take a few steps to actually disentangle that a little bit. Well, first is to say that a building is not form, right? Or rather that a building is not only form, right? At the very least, a building is something like a combination of form and program. Right? And if you want to put it in more general terms, you can say that a building is something like a three-dimensional material set of elements and relations between them. That's what we tend to call form usually, which are arranged in such a way that it can readily house a collection of human or human-related activities, which is what we tend to call program. Right? So central to the nature of the building is also the spatial organization embodying these elements, of course, as an entity in itself, as well as design processes such as construction, typological operations, contextual conjectures that lead up to the building as an outcome. Now, second is to say that in architecture in particular, it is important to distinguish between discursive and representational knowledge. By discursive here, we don't mean discursive in the 20th century, sort of Foucauldian meaning or interpretation of the term, but just in the classical sense of discourses, which is basically something like flow or current or creek. And it just basically alludes to the kind of knowledge that involves premises, narratives, concepts, ideas, terms, inferences, conclusions, as channeled through thought and expressed through language, right? Channeled through thought and expressed through language. Now, this is different by definition from representational knowledge, which instead proceeds through images, drawings, and models, and is the basis for the design practice and related fields such as the graphic analysis, for example. Right? So obviously the book, insofar as it is that type of book, targets the domain of discursive knowledge, even though it basically uses representational knowledge, not only discursive knowledge, to produce discursive knowledge. All right, so if that's the case, then one could suggest that architectural thinking is the practice of producing discursive knowledge through the discussion, analysis, conceptualization of aspects of two inextricably tied domains, that is the domain of the building and the domain of the design process leading up to the building. That's insofar as thinking is a gerund, it refers to that practice, the practice of producing that kind of knowledge. But insofar as as thinking is a noun, it also refers to all of the thinking as a repository of knowledge that has been produced throughout the history of architecture. Right? So it's both the practice of producing knowledge and the repository of that knowledge as well. Now, that means that architectural thinking is therefore a distinct domain of knowledge whose attributes reach well beyond form and aesthetics. And the reason I say that is because sometimes, especially on this side of the pond, a return or a focus on the building is interpreted as a return to form or a return to aesthetics. And actually that is not the case at all, right? Many attributes of architectural thinking are relatable to ontology, technology, and several modes of logic and phenomenology at least, right? So again, we're not going to talk about any of this. It's not into the philosophical of this, but just to clarify. All right, so now we're in a situation where we can discuss the difference between autonomy and specificity. So autonomy, two main trajectories, as you may know, the Italian and the American, and actually both of them are very, very different between them, but they do have something in common. And what they have in common is that they reduce architecture to a kind of itselfness. I mean, that's what Eisenman called integrity, for example, which is rooted in the essence of form, with a view to create a hermetically sealed, right? That's why they use terms like immanent or self-referential system out of that reduction, which is meant to fall outside of time and place. The reduction of architecture to a kind of itselfness rooted in the essence of form, which is meant to fall outside of time and place. So why is architectural thinking not autonomous by definition? Well, first and foremost, because architecture is not only form, right? So formal reductions of that sort are definitely a methodological option, but are not written into architecture's constitutive purposes. Right? And we kind of talked about how architecture is not formal only earlier on. In fact, by definition, architecture is social because of the nature of program. Right? Then second, architectural thinking may or may not search for timelessness and universals. Right? I mean, for those of us and folks interested in philosophy, that may be interesting indeed, but actually, as a matter of fact, any piece of architecture is actually bound to its time, which triggers the pursuit of historical knowledge as a matter of course. Right? And then third, architectural thinking cannot be some kind of closed-off epistemological field, but actually, on the contrary, is related to every other field and culture at large, because it's porous, right? I mean, in fact, there's no such a thing as any domain of knowledge which is completely closed off. I mean, not even set theory or logic, which are supposed to be like some of the ones that are the most quote-unquote autonomous, right? They are contingent on language, even those, right? All right, so maybe we can agree that such a thing cannot be autonomous. However, it is specific. Why is it specific? Because the processes involved in the design of buildings, as well as the characteristics of the outcome, actually feature a number of particularities that distinguish them fundamentally from those of a piece of music, a painting, a film, a novel, or a number of those realizations, notwithstanding the analysis that can be made after the fact between those mediums. So basically the corollary here is that while autonomy is grounded in specificity, in fact, specificity does not imply autonomy. All right, so what's the purpose here? Well, basically to proceed out of a combination of specificity and non-autonomy, to kind of attempt to propel architectural thinker to help or suggest ways in which architectural thinker could reach another level of importance on the map of the humanities and the social sciences by attempting to produce a kind of knowledge that could be described as architectural specific, architectural specific and yet generalizable. So rooted in the specificities of architectural thinking and yet applicable to fields outside of, beyond the boundaries of architecture. All right, so that was the, anyway, you kind of bore with me, that was the more, kind of more theoretical / philosophical part of the talk. So what remains now is hopefully more powerful. Just to talk a little bit about the structure of the book. Basically what you have is 30 examples, 30 buildings built or designed within the last 25 years. That's what the authors were asked to pick. And they're classified under 6 labels, which were chosen because of their direct relationship to architectural discourse, but then at the same time because they were elemental enough to be central to fields outside of architecture. So for example, if you're given these categories, those could apply the same way to, for example, a book that was done on art history, for example, right, or photography. So that's the first part, the main bulk of the book. Then the second section comprises 5 longer critical essays where the authors reflect on this notion of architectural thinking as a form of knowledge, as well as a number of intra and meta-disciplinary questions, partly through reflections on the book's materials. So maybe later, if anyone's interested, I can talk a little bit more about how the book actually was edited and produced, so that the conversation remained across the pages of the book, as opposed to just freezing out the content or asking for transcription. So basically, there's a kind of dynamic character to the way the essays were compiled and to the way they were later distributed to both respondents first, and then people who wrote the longer essays. And then lastly, there is another section where you find 5 shorter essays on the question of how this renewed interest in the building bears any impact, or could bear any impact, on the current status of architectural education. All right, so what I do to wrap up in the second half of the talk is to share with you 5 examples from from the book that speak to the first part of the agenda, and then another 5 examples that speak to the second part of the agenda. So on buildings that embody a historically significant contribution in terms of design aspects, building element or concept relevant to the reading of buildings in general. This is Penelope Dean, who wrote about Fujimoto's Any House. She claimed that this building could be understood as a radical dismantling of Albert Loss's Raum plan, because basically Fujimoto, what it does in her view is to evacuate the wall from the Raum plan, thereby turning it into something she calls a platform plan. So basically that's the idea for many of these essays, which is to place these examples within a historical lineage and then prove or demonstrate the way in which they actually embody an addition, something new to that particular lineage. She says a number of other things. I'm just going to maybe mention 1 or 2 more. She adds that early 20th century works of architecture discarded, eliminated the room only to reinstate the wall as a spatial divider in new guises. Basically what happens here is the very opposite, which is to say Fujimoto would retain the principle of the room and get rid of the vertical partition altogether. So instead of vertical partitions, what you have is offsets with the nominal thickness of what would have been partitions. Therefore, you can claim that basically here Fujimoto flipped modern architecture sideways, 90 degrees. This is Kostanskis from the AA, writing about Ensemble's truffle house. You may be familiar with this house, but if you're not, the construction process here was a little bit particular. So you dig up a hole in the earth, fill it up with hay, pour concrete around it, remove the earth, and then have a calf eat away at the hay to obtain an interior space. So Kizis argues that this house, rather than designed, was actually prescribed in terms of the process of its construction. So basically, every time you are working with the concrete in situ, there's always a risk in terms of not really being in control of what the building is going to look like. But usually there's an elaborate design for the cast that actually tries to prevent that from happening, so that you can actually be in control of the final result. Well, so here the opposite is the case. There's a kind of intentional roughness to the construction technique, which gives the truffle house its unpredictability. In other words, the cast is used to introduce uncertainty as opposed to certainty. Right? So that's the opposite of what tends to happen in Kizis view. John Morrow, writing on MPRDB's Expo 2000 Dutch Pavilion, he claims that this building was enacted a modification of the so-called 1901 theorem, as described by Rancujas in Davis, New York. So basically the image on the right of these suburban house plots supported on a massive steel structure, which described the possibility of stacking independent plots within the same building or within the same envelope. So Morrow argues that whereas in the 1901 theorem, the environmental and semantic autonomy of every floor was maintained, what happens in the pavilion is that those separations are reconsidered with a view to make the whole building function as an ecological organism. Right? So the surpluses and deficiencies from one floor are utilized on the next in terms of air, heat, water, light, and so on. So as a result of that, the pavilion's open structure materializes a principle, more rights of interconnection through separation and integration. Integration through separation and interconnection through separation and integration. Well, Sendai Mediatek, he's Juan Antonio Cortés writing about this project. He, of course, indicates that this is a case of free plan, so a building made of plates, columns, and facade, which are independent from one another. And the contribution here with respect to the lineage of the Maison Domino would be that, of course, the regular columns are replaced with these clusters of little tubes, which are capable or have the ability to house the flows of the building. Right? So again, place the building in a lineage and then demonstrate the way in which it embodies an addition, something new to that lineage. And lastly, Marc Frochot, writing on Sana's Rolex Center, in his view, the contribution here lies mainly in what he calls the management of thresholds. So basically, the programmatic fusion of spaces for verbal exchange with spaces which are totally quiet, totally silent, has a number of consequences for the library design. More important of which is that the usual walls or partitions that separate the different soundscapes are here replaced with 18 arches in pretension and a carpet that enable this sort of long topographical horizons, basically, this kind of artificial thresholds, which separate the different sound environments within the building. And then on top of that, the actual floor takes up the function of a seat and basically functions as a giant sofa. He talks about a number of things, basically to just end up making the argument that the management of threshold in this building functions on a number of different levels simultaneously, meaning energetic, distributional, and performative. All right, and then the more ambitious part, example in the book where the authors managed to suggest ways in which readings of buildings could actually become something that could have an impact beyond the discipline of architecture. So this is Stan Allen writing on Messi Antonio's Musac. He writes that the project's accomplishment is not so much to resolve contradictions or make didactic statement as it is to suspend and dissolve apparent oppositions. So if you take that claim and abstract it away from the reading of the building, you realize that it is abstract enough and it has enough semantic content that actually could be applicable to a number of realities and discursive problems and situations outside the field of architecture. This is Etienne Santiago writing on a typical suburban American house. He claims that these kinds of houses actually embody a totally new way of thinking about how a set of things, so not only rooms, but actually people, information, objects, can be arranged, linked, systematized, organized. And he calls this space super urban. And in his view, challenges older ways of conceiving boundaries and connection between various elements. So basically, this is an example where somebody identifies an organizational model embodied in a building, in this case a suburban house, which could have epistemological consequences in terms of interpreting the world or interpreting realities outside of architecture itself. There's Amanda Risser-Lawrence writing on the New Barnes Foundation. She puts forward the notion of architectural sameness, and she asks the question, how do we talk about sameness in architecture? In her view, there has been a search of terms such as copyright or duplicate textures and revision, allegory, terms around this question of the copy over the last 5 years. And we lack, in her view, a theoretical framework through which to distinguish these unrelated and yet non-identical concepts and terms. But to me, what's more interesting perhaps is that this question of sameness could be relevant to fields such as art history, photography, or metaphysics, where the question of sameness has been essential basically since their inception. Alexander Rugia, writing on OMA's Dubai Renaissance, she proposes the notion of architectural iconolatry as opposed to iconicity. And to that effect, she describes this building as one of the absolute, what she calls the absolute exterior, meaning one that's waiting to absorb and then in turn project any meaning. So basically, insofar as it can do that, in her view, this building becomes kind of the epitome of our current condition where the obsession with the rapid proliferation of images actually prevents the formation of any stable meaning, and that in turn is a feature, one of the staples of 21st century capitalism. So basically, iconology would refer to those buildings whose very condition as an icon or a sign is defined by an unstable semantic identity as opposed to a stable semantic identity. So for folks interested in questions of meaning and representation, political economic representation, this notion of iconology would certainly be relevant. And then last, Benjamin was a philosopher, that's why there's no picture there. He proposes this duality of terms, building in regular typeface and in italics. Building in regular typeface would refer to the networks of relations that precede the conception and the construction of buildings, whereas building in italics would refer to the networks of relations that are internal to the building and therefore purely disciplinary, such as materials, programs, circulation, and so on. So for him, what's at stake here is the reconceptualization of these two networks of relations, and in particular, how the latter, meaning the disciplinary one, the one in italics, can be thought of in terms of what he calls countermeasure, which is basically in relation to the introduction of forms of creativity which could stand counter to the global, or othering the global, or redistributing forces and networks and relations in the global, which is the locus of basically building in regular typeface. So he kind of turns into, what he does in a way is he turns the agenda for the project into a kind of metaphysics, so to speak. All right, so these are some 60 terms that are proposed in the book pertaining to architectural thinking. It turns out that if you look closely enough, if you zoom in, architectural thinking is actually a pretty sophisticated mode of knowledge. It's not just spatial kind of thinking, which sometimes gets dumbed down to be that. So this is the first kind of expansion that we were aiming for with this project, a kind of expansion from within, a kind of implosion. And then the second kind of expansion will be one into out. So you can imagine picking and choosing a number of terms from that list and then develop them discursively and theoretically with a view to create a system of thought that actually could have an impact on fields outside of architecture. So that would be the second kind of expansion we're aiming for, one that's into out. So while I show you a few pages from the book to wrap up, just to say that in attempting to grow architecture's discursive capacities from within and then ignite its potential to expand its limits and audiences, that's the way that this particular project aspires to bridge between the domain of history and theory and the domain of studio pedagogy and practice, and for that to be successful, as Dora Epstein-Jones puts it in the book, basically the current history of theory project would have to be extended as opposed to contracted, right? It seems like focusing on the building would imply a kind of narrowing, but actually here the argument, as I said, is that there's kind of double expansion that's necessary for the project of history and theory to successfully bridge between that domain and design. And on that somewhat paradoxical note, I'm going to end. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jose, for an intense presentation. Before I open it up to the rest of the panelists, and as a way of warming up the room, probably I would like to zoom out and start with the question of the reason of this book was was written. It's the fact that you kind of identify that in the last few years there's been the position of architecture has been diluted, and therefore we have to kind of like come back and position ourselves in and center architecture in what it should really be. And there's this interesting paragraph at the beginning of the Aragüez Jones saying, no one would imagine a biologist making a conference about living organisms, or a journalist asking what is a newspaper, so why are we architects asking what is a building, you know, like what happens in the last few years to ask us that question. And in a way, I wonder if, have we already solved that question, or if it's a question that has always been solved, but it's lost relevance and then it becomes relevant again. And you know, I feel like architectural discourse sometimes it's almost like a wave that comes back and forth. You just have to wait until the wave comes back. Normally it would take longer for that wave to turn, and you think, I don't know, Bramante was born in the Renaissance and died in the Renaissance, but now we've gone through so many architectural, you know, momentums in our lives, and these momentums are even faster and faster. So in a way, a question, did the book come already too late, or did the book come even too early? Or maybe probably the answer is that there's no late or early, it's just that it's something that it's always been relevant. You know?
Are you guys gonna like speak one at a time, or should I?
I think with the idea would be like we can all start jumping into the conversation.
I have a question.
You were talking about specificity versus autonomy. What is intended here with specificity? Is a programmatic difference between each building, or is a context relation?
All right. No. By specificity, I was just trying to indicate that there's a number of aspects that distinguish architectural thinking from the kind of thinking in the discursive sense and design thinking in the practice sense that make architecture fundamentally different from a piece of music, a novel, sculpture, or any number of those realizations, even though, of course, we should establish analogies between those mediums after the fact, or while we're working, for sure, as they can be productive, but there's a fundamental difference between them. So specificity just refers to that condition of being distinct or unique among those other modes of production.
And autonomy is intended as a political meaning, as Tafuri was mentioning in the 70s, or was more like what is now intended as autonomy of the form.
Yeah,
like
so
some new generation of architects
so
started to.
Yeah, definitely. And this new generation of architects basically belong in a tradition that here in the US had a lot of weight with people like, of course, Pearson and some of New 5, but also focusing more on the architectural outlet actually, but also in the Italian tradition coming from Rossi, which was looking more at the city actually, so that's why I said it's a different kind of autonomy. It has actually a number of other sort of features to it and goals, and it has to do with the autonomy of form, basically. And then people have been writing about those later and interpreting a kind of political side of it and potential effect, which of course has been very, very effective in some cases, I think. But basically that comes from that tradition of arguing that there's this possibility of understanding a piece of architecture as a watertight, sealed, immanent, self-referential number of physical elements.
Thank you for the lecture. I was struck by maybe two positions. One is the proposal for design thinking, but also Monica's essay on design research not being a fit. And it makes me think about the epistemological frameworks at play when we're talking about the building as an object and what the kind of epistemic virtue of this project would be, given the way in which it's being played out in the book, in a series of lectures. And to me, it seems that, let's say, a critique of interdisciplinarity and maybe research as found in the sciences is a critique of objectivity, perhaps as a mode of, a framework for knowledge.
Yep.
And that maybe we're moving, or the project is moving towards preferring of training and expertise. So given the people who wrote in the book and given the people who are in the panels, if that is something that you agree with, how does that knowledge get transferred?
Yeah, it's extremely relevant. There's on the one hand the acceptance that architectural thinking is not a science, of course, and that design is not a science, the way we practice it in architecture. But at the same time, there is the hope that there are ways to establish indeed epistemological frameworks for being able to make arguments on solid grounds, as a way to be able to determine, or at least to discuss, what it is to produce something like newness in architecture. So that's why...
Sorry, like?
Newness.
Newness.
Yeah, like something is new.
Newness. Okay.
That's why of all the things we could do with the building, we chose to you know, to discuss what it means for a building to embody historicism, because basically those significant contributions, as historically understood, grow the discipline of architectural thinking in ways that perhaps are not so different from the way certain discoveries in the sciences proceed, or in mathematics, or in philosophy, where basically people who are working on experiments tend to look at what has already been done as a way to say, hey, so we're actually able to, you know, to add something to it. So there is this analogy with the sciences, even though, of course, it's not the best.
So, what's the dilemma here exactly? I mean, it's within art history. It's in there.
There's no dilemma.
Okay.
What do you mean by dilemma?
Well, I'm just trying to see where the question is, and then where the answer is. I mean, if the question is your essay at the beginning, absolutely. But if it's the essays at the back, not at all. Other than it doesn't actually, from my point of view, progress the subject. In the terms that are set out in your essay, which are very provocative and correct, I think, and necessary. But I don't see that come through. Much as I enjoy the writing, I don't see that come through generally in the body of the book. And so then, but when you say earlier, oh, but this isn't about pedagogy or construction or design, it's about our history, I kind of go, oh, well then, is that not what you said?
What I said is that I set the terms for the project on the basis of a number of arguments and propositions which come out of a critique of history and theory. However, the goal is to ultimately bridge between history theory and studio and practice, which is why I presented what I present.
Well, then it seems that if it's a kind of a Cavaliers versus Roundheads situation, you know, if it's problematized like that, there's the building and there's those who write about the building. It seems really interesting to actually get, if you could get to the point where actually art history is in control of the subject, that it is driving it, rather than behind it and critiquing it, that it's actually moving it forward, which is what you're offering, what you're suggesting, that it goes in charge, that not the Roundheads but the Cavaliers are in charge. Then I think you get into a very interesting opposition. But for that to happen, the Cavaliers have to really understand building.
I fully agree.
And then the Roundheads will follow. But there's nothing to follow.
So if we see it like this, your opposition to certain Italian architects of the 60s and certain American architects of the 60s is because of the fact that these guys decided to write themselves their own theory and didn't wait for somebody else. So you would like to go back to the model in which, I don't know, Gideon was writing the theory of the modern movement, and then the modern movement architect should do the modern architecture.
I personally don't care about who is the person that writes, actually. It could be the architect, it could be the historian, it could be the theorist, right? I personally just look at the material itself. And in that sense, I actually did not oppose the Italians or the Americans, right? I'm just trying to disentangle a very common confusion between the term autonomy and specificity, which actually in this country, for example, harks back to somebody like Greenberg and the way he was interpreted in architectural circles. So oftentimes in debates, when you mention the term specificity, that's immediately put in the category of autonomy, while actually what we're trying to argue here is that autonomy and specificity are two different things. While it is hard to claim, if possible at all, that architectural thinking is autonomous, I think it is not by definition, as I said. It is, however, specific, right, for reasons that I explained to her. But that doesn't mean that I'm going against the Italians or the Americans. Actually, I think there were a lot of productive outcomes out of both those projects.
So, but honestly, it seems to me, at least from the lecture, that you are going against those positions that I think is more than legitimate. Because if I understood it correctly, one of the points is that you argue against the building task. And this is something that I think is quite complicated because it raises a lot of issues. I mean, I agree with you, the building as signifier of some signified thing makes no sense. The building as representation, direct representation of whatever form of power or political agenda also makes no sense, blah, 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 blah. The building is a building, it's a dumb thing, it doesn't speak. And we are all happy it doesn't. But then the point is, if the building, it's just the building. If it's so dumb, like if we reduce it is already dumb, but if we are reduced to complete dumbness, then the question is, what is the cultural relevance of architecture? Because the point to me is this, and I think we take the fact that architecture is culture practice that we can measure together with music or painting or novel writing, but this is not obvious. This doesn't happen in all culture, and this happens in our culture. And it happens less and less to a certain extent, and it happens less and less because the one who invested so much in this idea that architecture is a form of knowledge were the Romans, who were, already the Greeks didn't care that much about architecture, the Chinese even less, the Arabs not so much. I mean, it's only the people who inherited a certain idea of architecture from the Romans in a relatively irreflective way, I think, who are bound to this idea that architecture is as relevant as other cultural practice. But then the question is, why is architecture relevant? And I think architectural buildings are culturally relevant because the buildings are also to a certain extent, has something else. I think there's a fantastic definition by Giorgio Grassi that, to me, solves this problem. And Grassi wrote that buildings are, in Italian, gli edifici sono oggetto e rappresentazione delle leggi che li governano. So the buildings are the subject and the representation of the laws that govern themselves. So the buildings are fundamentally two things. They are the product of these laws or these rules imposed, but they're also a representation. So they are fundamentally double, and they are always fundamentally lying. Now, if the buildings are not lying anymore, if the buildings are not anymore as something else, then they're not so relevant culturally anymore. So I would argue in favor of a little bit of, at least, of building past.
So the building as, to me, was less of a dumbness than something really complex, which is that it makes me think of what is it when you don't use metaphor, or what is the object of building as you kind of described it, when you don't use distinction as a mode of analytical thinking. And then it's kind of the same question about the epistemological framework. How do you start to define the object of building as a form, which I think was part of the lecture last week, the form and the question. It's very interesting. It's amazing to read about buildings, but it becomes, to me, the opposite of dumb.
Yeah, exactly, right? There's nothing dumb about either way, right? Either the building as or the building as such, right? Dominant pattern, and I should have clarified actually earlier, of course, this project is born into a very particular milieu of history and theory. So, I mean, as you saw, I've also toured Europe, and of course I get a lot of different reactions as to even this question of history and theory, because Europe follows a different track, of course, and different methodologies. And this was born in this particular network of scholarship. So in this particular network of scholarship and its main interlocutors, some of which are in Europe, most of what you find is the building as to this day. So that's a historical pattern. Actually, it's not a cycle. I mean, you can actually track that there was this paradigm shift, as other people have argued, actually not only myself, around the 60s, which you can clearly separate out from the previous epochs, if you will, and that has historical reasons for that as well. But most of what you find in the scholarly domain of history, architecture, history, and theory today is the building as. Right? So part of the argument here is to say, as I said, look, that's great, exactly, right? I mean, that helps us understand the cultural relevance of buildings, of architectural thinking, political role, and so on. But just interrogate, just ask the question whether when you're actually writing about the building as something else, whether the actual content of architectural thinking gets evacuated from the discussion. And oftentimes you will find that that is the case. So here what we want with this project is to, as I say here in the US, to eat our cake and to have our cake and eat it, to do both at the same time. So to be able to write about architecture without evacuating the concept of architectural thinking while remaining relevant and while being able to address questions outside of the domain of architecture. So we want to do both things. Neither staying within the confines of autonomous discussions and only practice and so on of design, nor go all the way to talking about the building as something else while leaving architectural thinking behind. But we want to do both. And so part of the critique here is that actually that doesn't necessarily happen very often.
Yeah, but maybe I don't get, but I think there are two things that are a little bit different. There's the building has, from the point of view of the architect, of the who produced the building, a certain intention, and also from, I would say, in terms of architecture, also from the point of view of who uses the building and decodes the building. Then there's the building has that is probably a narrower definition inside of a discussion of art history. That's a discussion more of art history per se, in the sense that in order to relate artistic practice to history more in general, the building or the painting or blah 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 has been seen as the manifestation of the zeitgeist, and there can be no art history without this fundamental first idea that in the end is an idea of Hegel. And I don't really understand what maybe you want to operate on both planes, but I don't think the planes are the same.
No, indeed. I mean, if you read, I agree with that. If you read, Malvezzi, or you read Sidney, or you read Alan Kohum, or you read Kenneth Frampton, or you read Robin Evans, for example, all of those guys, in my view, were extremely brilliant because they actually managed to negotiate the two planes simultaneously and to actually discuss topics in one as pitched against the other. But part of the diagnosis here, part of the historical analysis of the discursive production of architecture, again within specific circles and its interlocutors, that that doesn't happen anymore. Right? That it's basically most of it pertains to a particular plane but not the other. Right? Because most of the content, again, involving architectural thing has been evacuated, basically. Right? And there are reasons for that, which we could potentially also discuss, but not only me actually, but a lot of other people would like to kind of, in a way, return to this lineage of people I just mentioned, where the two planes were negotiated simultaneously for productive purposes.
And sorry, this is a bit mean, but okay. And why didn't you write book yourself, arguing this position, instead of putting together this very complex architecture that unavoidably doesn't come out with a single voice, with a single proposition?
Because I was not interested in just putting out my own view on the topic, but actually I was interested in developing a project of, if you will, collective intelligence basically around this question, and get as far beyond as possible, or far away as possible from the domain where the project originated, meaning these particular kind of schools and the UN's environment and so on, to actually see what people think in other places, right? And to see how this problem is understood and dealt with in situations with actors whose training is completely different, whose set of values is completely different, and who come from totally different traditions. So this discussion, for example, has nothing to do with the one I had in Italy just 3 months ago in Turin, which was, by the way, extremely good. Incredibly good, as opposed to ours. To be honest.
Including this one.
Yeah, no problem.
It was great so far.
I'm wondering about the impact all this can have on the field outside of architecture, because this was one of your main claims, and in a way I see a certain contradiction between the aim to bring back the discussion inside of the field to its real base, to the architecture itself, let's say the building, architecture as building, and then on the other side to make the link to the outside. So this for me is not at all clear how is the whole discussion seen from the outside? What is the repercussion of your book outside of the field of architecture?
That's a very good question. We knew from the get-go that that second objective, that second goal, we were not going to fulfill. Right? I was going to say entirely, but I'm going to say now even better. Right? But at least we wanted to put it out there as a possibility, and to have the authors at least project ways in which that engagement could happen. So for that to actually happen, what's missing here is a second part of the project where instead of engaging people from architecture, I will engage people from outside of architecture, basically, with the similar topic in mind, or fostering conversations across some of the topics you're finding today, and see how, whether or not that would be productive for them and for us. That's the part of the project.
But is it possible, or is it rather contradiction? Because I always have the impression that when I talk to people outside of architecture about what we're doing, I talk differently than we're talking here. And so I don't know if it's the same aim or in a way contradiction.
Yeah, so three things to that. I think there are at least two ways to start to think about that as a real possibility as opposed to an endogamic game, basically. One is to use terms which are important and central to us, but also to fields outside of architecture. That's one way. Second is to, as I presented, to try to come up with ideas and notions which have something in common between architecture and, say, photography, say, metaphysics, say, philosophy, say, politics, and so on. And then third, the one thing that I think is missing today, in spite of all the talk involving interdisciplinarity and climate change and politics and intelligence and so on, there are long-term projects involving people from fields outside of architecture. Not just a one-off conference, not just a one-off event, but actually long-term interdisciplinary projects involving people from different fields. Maybe you guys know more about that and know that actually those projects aren't happening, but at least, in this case, I'm based in New York, and I don't see that happening. I see a lot of discussion about those questions, but I see them as, events in series lectures or writings here and there, yes, but actually long-term engagements, long-term projects, I don't see.
What kind of projects are you thinking of?
5 or 6 people to whom could be architects or architectural thinkers or historians, and then the other 4 coming from other fields, working over a 5-year period or 10-year period on a series of themes that could, could be determined on the basis of their relevance across disciplines. Of course, with a view to address issues that are timely and relevant for today.
I mean, on an abstract level, I agree, but let's say very practically. So, for example, I'm teaching in Weimar, Bauhaus University, and we have collaborations, of course, with people who are doing investigation in materials, and so we have sociology, we have urban designers, we have designers, artists, and there is constantly collaboration. Yeah. So I'm wondering if it's, of course, if you talk about more the academic way, then you say, okay, when you say, okay, we don't want to really touch architecture as matter, and rather stay in the cloud of, let's say, talking about it, and so of course then it becomes a little vague, and maybe this is why this is not happening, because everybody is really likes to stay in his own cloud. Yeah. But on a practical level, let's say when you like in chemistry or biology, there is collaboration all the time. It's all interdisciplinary because they are all doing their stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, all of these arguments, all of these claims just refer to the domain of history and theory, right? Not to the domain of material research and all that. Where actually I would argue you do see a lot more of that, for example, in this very city. But the domain of history and theory, I personally don't see it very often, but again, this is a genuine question. I mean, if you guys do see it, please bring it up. I do see them short term, I see them occasionally, but really long-term engagements.
I had a similar question, which is why the will to translate out, and it made me think about the 6 categories, the words that you chose as the mediating keywords. And words might be the linchpin to the efficacy of that translation,
Yeah.
but they seem more like schema. As sort of like non-empirical words that might facilitate that translation, as opposed to the way in which you describe object, which I quite like in the beginning, which is that it has to be both empirical and non-empirical. And so I wonder why that switch. Was it just to facilitate translation? Because it seems like, let's say the word sharpness might be one way to do it.
I mean, I guess what we do in architecture as well as art history is to read and interpret physical objects in the empirical world and turn them into ideas, concepts, terms, and so on through a number of discursive operations, basically, which are mental or intellectual or through writing. So that's a different mode of practice than material research or design by definition. Now, the reason why I clarify this thing with the empirical object is because it has been pointed out to me, I think very rightly so, that a building doesn't necessarily have to be an object in the empirical sense. Meaning, again, a physical entity with clear-cut boundaries that you can clearly distinguish from each other. There are buildings that are designed in such a way that, boundaries are blurred or they intervene in particular ways, and you would have a hard time actually applying the label object to that as an empirical thing. So that's why I say it's an object of knowledge, but indeed, actually, that's the idea is that basically you have to kind of negotiate the empirical character of architecture and its intellectual or discursive context, basically, as rivals, as distinct.
When you produce that lexicon at the end of, you've clipped out the useful, possibly useful vectors for going forward with the in the collaboration. Why did you do that? I mean, like, why would you, if it's about looking at the building, are you not reverting to type at the end by offering mechanisms or codes rather than just leaving it, there's the well, be in the well? Why do we have these tools that you've invented, let's say, to progress the project? When the project is seated over here, why does it go in that direction as well as?
Well, I mean, I guess by showing an array of terms, you can kind of demonstrate or emphasize the way in which the domain of architectural thinking can be grown, can be expanded, can be extended, can be diversified in terms of its conceptual content and historical content.
Is it not antithetical, though, to your central argument?
No, actually, I think that was the goal, right? The goal is to take the building as an empirical object that you can turn into concepts, ideas, arguments, and so on, and then see how, by doing that operation, you can actually grow the domain of architectural thinking.
But they're not similes. They're not similes.
Some of them are used as metaphors in the book. Many others are not used as metaphors. We have to go one by one.
I'd like to open the discussion to the audience if anyone has questions or.
Thanks for your lecture. I'm interested in this distinction you made between discursive and representational knowledge, and sort of one of the ambitions of the book as a form of accessing discursive knowledge through representation. One of the things I'm sort of having a little bit of trouble with is that in the act of making this book and accompanying each one of these projects with a very specifically positioned piece of writing, the reader of the book now is not actually, is not actually accessing discursive knowledge through a representational object, but is now accessing discursive knowledge through a very specific discursive object, the essay about the images. So I don't know what you think about that.
That's very good. Can we agree that both are happening simultaneously? That if you are the reader, insofar as half of the pages in the book are actually pictures and images, representational knowledge actually still plays a role. Therefore, the reader is left with enough agency to interpret or negotiate the pictures and drawings he or she is seeing in relation to the argument being made in the piece. And if he or she is a critical reader as opposed to a more passive reader, then he or she will be able to sift through the argument and actually see whether there's something fallacious or something that doesn't hold or something that doesn't work, then form his or her own opinion about it or his or her own argument about it, and then relate it back or not, depending on the kind of piece and the kind of reader, to the pictures and drawings and models in focus.
That's ideal. Yeah, that's right. I have another question. You sort of talked about frames of judgment initially, and like there's some correct frames of judgment for architecture or accessing architecture, and some which you would consider inappropriate. At the end of this process of curating all of these essays and all of these buildings, do you feel like every essay in this book, at least in your opinion, is a correct frame of judgment about the work that is sort of taking the position of that?
I don't think so, no. To respond more fully. Again, you would have to go not only essay by essay, but actually even in some cases paragraph by paragraph. I mean, in some cases, basically you have authors who, well, in my modest view, do equivocate, large sections or basically the basic interpretation in terms of applying a frame of judgment that doesn't kind of correspond to the object, I think. But in some of the cases, it's just reduced to, one paragraph, two paragraphs, and in some cases it's not. So again, it's on the reader as a critical agent to be able to identify that.
So as someone who thinks that this sort of correct frame of judgment is so important, was there a point you ever considered like removing the essays that were like, I don't like what this person is saying about this building?
No, that never happened, because I think, even if one can argue that maybe certain frames of judgment don't map so accurately to certain objects, it is still extremely useful and in some cases very productive actually to have those misalignments, not only in a book like this, but actually I happen to think in any discussion. I mean, that's how opinions get formed, that's how views arise, that's how one can kind of position oneself. And so it's not about removing or filtering, but it's just about being able to distinguish or make arguments, I guess.
On the note of like an interdisciplinary project that's long term, there was mention about how journalists never have conferences about newspapers, which I think they do have that meta discussion, and like same for biologists and living organisms. There's like theorists who have that meta discussion in the same way that architects obviously have a meta discussion in terms of theory and history. Would that, to have a thing that isn't in practice or isn't grounded in like matter, in the case of like material interdisciplinary research or like sociology, would it have to be theorists and historians of architecture meeting with theorists and historians of other fields, or could there be a crossing between practitioners of other fields and historians of this field?
For sure. I mean, that's why half of the people who participated in this project were practitioners, actually. Right? Of course. Yeah.
But I mean, from architecture to a different field,
yes.
Like not with practitioners of architecture, but of historians and theorists.
Yeah, I was offering that as an analogy, but for sure.
How would you see that happening? What would be the product of that, or what would be the end goal of the project?
I don't know that I have any more energies left to do the meeting project for another 5 years involving those people, but if I did, if I had, I would. Basically, that's what would have to happen, right? I mean, you would have to gather these people from all of these different domains, meaning basically a matrix of 4, right? So in architecture, people on the discursive side and people on the practice side, and then in any number of those other fields, people who actually make or process or design, and people who think about it and write about it. And with that matrix of 4 kinds of participants, you basically put together a similar project for the next 5 years. So if you want to do it yourself, maybe I can offer some consultancy.
Yeah, Daniel's question made me think about something in regards to your editing of the book, and your answer being that each essay is a kind of instantiation of architectural knowledge, which is a kind of objective point of view, right? that the specificity of each essay is as virtuous or as valid. Was that intentional? Because it seems contradictory to maybe some of the things that we were talking about earlier.
You mean the fact that every essay puts forth a particular point?
Well, more that the role of the editor, and maybe that can be sort of explained a little bit, but the answer made me think that every essay was allowed to be what it wanted, as opposed to the cutting out, which is a different kind of framework.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are nuances to that. I mean, as that has to do with your role as an editor, right? I mean, the fact that you have to allow all of these different voices to express themselves, and you cannot cancel them out, or you cannot change them if they're not convenient to your agenda, or they don't apply right kind of judgment or whatever. I mean, you have to allow that, but at the same time, you can offer some suggestions to kind of steer certain essays in certain directions, which you think are going to be more productive to the project as a whole. So basically, balancing out and juggling those two sides of the equation, I think properly edited book would come out. That was the not to silence any voices, but basically to see how everything could kind of more or less coalesce in spite of the differences.
I don't see the connection between the first part of the book, which is, I think, a good description of examples of building the last 25 years. And then the second part of, but there are many parts, not just two, but second part, 3 parts. Then the critical essay. So it seems to be just a casual combination of good descriptive text. I read the text about the Toyo Ito house and Fujimoto. So, and maybe I read I had to read more. But what I saw, and it was like a good description with historical references, but not more than that. So it was not, like for me, it was not generating new discourses around the thematic.
You mean the first 30 texts, or in the second section?
No, I mean, yeah, because I read it in your introduction, so I think you were supposed to make a connection between the two parts, the critical essay and the description of the buildings. But I don't see the relation.
Yeah. So what we requested from these people writing those long essays was that they addressed and in fact critique the content of the book. So what I did was I collected the first 25 short essays first. Then I distributed them to the respondents for every section. Then once I got those responses back, I had 30 texts. Then I forwarded those to the people writing those 5 longer texts for them to actually reflect on those 30 texts, so that the conversation, as I said, the conversation is kept across the pages of the book as opposed to just freezing out the content. And then what you get is that 2 or 3 of those essays did that very directly, I think, such as Ursprung and Dora, whereas others veered in different directions. So what assuming and like foreseeing that was going to happen, basically what I asked them to do also was to reflect on the question of architectural thinking as a form of knowledge, as a topic of discussion, knowing that they could do it satisfactorily. It's based on Michael, for example, I think the agreement was question of the theory of figure. There was a way to address that problem directly. So those were the two sort of tasks that I was hoping to get from those 5 essays, and I think largely it's there. But it's a different kind of text, I agree. It's a different kind of text from the first 30 texts.
Well, I think with that we'll finish the event. Thank you very much, Jose, for a great discussion, and we hope this continues in 5 more years from here.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.